Hello and welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Memories. I am Wax the Brain Hussein, joined as always by Fash, the $1 million fan. Fash.
Why are you laughing, Wax? What's so funny?
I just realised your background looks a bit different. We're missing something.
We are missing something. You know, I've not got the arcade out today, Wax. And you'll notice there's no pool balls on the pool table. It's a bit more somber environment today, Wax, given the topic that you've selected. So I'm going with that. And obviously, it's snowing here in Glasgow, a lot of snow. And we are shooting during the day, so there won't be the usual Wrestling with Memories red light. So yeah, a little bit more of a somber mood today, if you don't mind.
And maybe that actually feeds in with another set of releases by the WWE
it does.
over the last couple of nights. I think the most notable one being maybe William Regal and Road Dogg. And maybe even Samoa Joe.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what Nick Khan and Vince McMahon are up to, I mean, they're not going to win any popularity contests at the start of 2022. William Regal, you're right, the biggest shock. I mean, he's been such a great servant to the company, not just as a wrestler, general manager, or the general manager of NXT, but, you know, in terms of the development and the training of various athletes. You just saw the outpouring of emotion on Twitter after the news came from existing and past wrestlers. So that's a really odd one. It seems like another one of Triple H's allies is being culled. Wax, you might have some views on that and the conspiracies around that. Samoa Joe, I mean, he got fired, he came back, got fired again. I guess injuries are not helping him, but that's a bit of a shame. He could certainly add value somewhere else. I really liked him for the short stint that he had as a commentator as well.
Yep.
So I think he's got value. Road Dogg, I mean, obviously a big name. I don't know much about, you know, how great he was as a producer. You get mixed reviews on that. But his buddies in AEW, so maybe they could do with a producer. So it's going to be very interesting in terms of, you know, if any of these names turn up anywhere else. Maybe William Regal just wants to retire back to England now. Who knows? But what's your views on this? Is Triple H and his team getting shafted? Is HBK next?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I wonder if HBK would ever get fired from the WWF. We know that Vince has a very soft spot for him. And certainly seems like the transition of Triple H being the most hated guy in wrestling to being one of the most loved guys in wrestling he's
a very sympathetic figure now, isn't he?
It's really interesting. And I would love to cover that one day. But let's move on. Let's.
Well, just one final point before you do move on. I'm just a little quip there, a joke, and we'll cover it in the future. But obviously, recent weeks we found out that Nick Khan is a good friend of The Rock, which people weren't aware of.
Yeah,
so is The Rock going to be the owner of WWE in the future, or a conglomerate with Rock as the face? That's something to discuss. It's a very interesting and fun rumor with all the other conspiracy theories that are going out. Maybe Rock is going to stick it to Triple H one final time, and what a way to do it, to show he was indeed the man during the Attitude Era.
Yeah, something we definitely need to talk about in a future episode.
Definitely.
But the reason why we're here, the thing that we've promised so often and failed to deliver so far, is we want to talk about the scandals that hit the WWF in the early 90s. We talk so much about this period being a period of upheaval, a period of change, transition, and really a lot of that was driven by what's happening behind the scenes as much as anything else. And one of the biggest elements of that was the whole steroid trial. But even before the trial, actually, just what's happening in the US and what's happening in the WWF and all sports in relation to steroids. So that's what we're covering today in our part one of the scandals episode. And part two coming up, we'll talk about the sexual misconduct.
You're laughing again, Wax. I know this is like your expert topic, which might say a lot about Wax, but he's very interested in talking about that as well. Yeah, certainly we've been signposting this, as you say, since the early episodes, but given this is a timeline overview in terms of what we like to do, we've kind of got to the bit now where you can see evident impacts from what's going on behind the scenes on screen, and certainly I think this is a very appropriate time to delve into those backstage issues and something that was really throwing Vince McMahon and his company off. Okay, Wax, so right now, as we talk about, you know, showing where we are in the WWF landscape, we are in the fall of 1992, and we are going to see some impacts of these scandals on screen. So why don't you give us a bit of an overview and outline where we are to this day? What's actually been going on in the early 90s with respect to the steroid scandal, maybe before anything else?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is anabolic steroids. And I know there's lots of other prescription medicine, human growth hormones, and all sorts of stuff that was going on. But specifically what we're talking about is steroids, and what got Vince McMahon into a lot of trouble thereafter. And, we talk about steroids now very differently to how they were first perceived. Steroids weren't always illegal. There was a bill passed in the early 90s or late 80s, making them a controlled substance. I think that wasn't actually implemented until 1990. Prior to that, anabolic steroids were made illegal by most sporting governing bodies. But this is where WWF always sort of falls through the cracks, because it's not really a sport. It is difficult to classify at the time. The public could still use anabolic steroids, at that time before the 90s. And it was only after the bill was passed that it became a controlled substance. And, even though it's controlled, you can still get access to anabolic steroids through a pharmacist or a doctor. Obviously, it had to be prescribed to an athlete for it to be used legally.
And as you're saying, Wax, it's that distinction, because typically when you think about steroids, even today, it always goes into the realm of performance enhancement, right? So somebody's taking these to run faster or hits, with more force or what have you. And this is where the sports entertainment phrase was really coined when it came to this kind of stuff, and just the general scripted nature of professional wrestling, where, the WWF and other wrestling organizations could say, well, they're not actually a sport. If these things are being taken, they're not being taken to gain an advantage. Yep. In a fair competition. Really, it's about the look, isn't it? It's about the presentation more than anything else. Certainly, that would be the base argument.
And I mean, what is the main reason for using steroids, Fash? It is mostly to change your appearance.
Yeah, I mean, not everybody has got, God-given Greek bodies like us. So for those that don't, they might take shortcuts, and steroids is one of those ways. So certainly, when we talk about the time, you're talking about the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s. You now go back and look at that period, and you do see people that are really jacked up, be it in movies, be it in professional wrestling, bodybuilding competitions, etc. It seemed to just be a cultural thing that had taken place, maybe especially in the United States.
Yeah, and maybe a misconception that people always think is you pop the pill and suddenly you start developing these muscles. But no, actually, you do have to put in the work. Even then, you still need to go down to the gym and do exactly what you were doing. But it does enhance your muscles. It enhances your look and gets you there quicker than you would otherwise have got. I mean, after 1990, this was all formed up in law. All of the public knew this was a controlled substance, and also trafficking of steroids would become a felony, and that's important for what would come later, and something we'll discuss in a separate episode when we cover the actual trial against the WWF and Vince McMahon. Why we're talking about it in the late 80s, early 90s is that a Dr. George Zahorian was about to be convicted, but he was about to stand trial over his links with various organizations and him providing these steroids without real medical cause. And why he's important for WWF is that during the 80s and 90s, he was appointed by, I think it was the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission to appear at WWF events as a doctor. Through that, and through doing that for many years, his links with wrestlers became quite strong, links with Vince McMahon himself. And through that period, wrestlers would often go to him to get those steroid pills that they wouldn't necessarily medically be required to have. So as soon as the WWF gets wind that, George Zahorian's in trouble, they want to cut ties as early as they can. However, what I've come across is some evidence that says that, they actually knew some of this was potentially going to cause them trouble, but there was thought that, at that point, there was no risk immediately to the WWF. And even there's a comment from Pat Patterson that comes up where he goes, the wrestlers need their candy.
That is something I have heard as well.
Initially mentions it.
Yeah. Allegedly, we should say still.
Yeah, allegedly, and it's not until they actually get a tip off to say George Zahorian he is going to be standing trial very shortly, And Linda and Vince decide, you know what, at that point they need to stop using Zahorian, otherwise there's going to be big trouble. And Zahorian wasn't on trial for providing these pills to wrestlers. He was on trial for providing them illegally to bodybuilders. And it's only after the investigation is sort of started that they realize there are actually wrestlers involved here as well. There are, I think, a few names that pop up. And one name, obviously, we'll talk about in a lot more detail. But I think some of the other ones, Fash, I don't know if you have a list, but Roddy Piper, for example, was on that list.
Yeah, I think Rick Martel was on that list, perhaps. Was one of the Killer Bees on that list?
Yep, one of the Killer Bees was on there. And I can't remember the fourth.
B. Brian Blair, yeah, so I think it was him. And I'm trying to rack my brain in terms of who else was there. But it was kind of what you would say outside of Piper. I mean, Martel, the four names were not the most, the largest stars at the time of this trial, given, Piper had also, he was kind of semi-retirement at this stage. Rick Martel had been, yes, a champion in the AWA, but then since, he'd been a tag team wrestler in WWE, and then after that, now he was in his kind of initial heel run as the model Rick Martel. But it's really the fifth name, Wax, which was actually a pseudonym. They didn't actually reveal the actual name, but it was a very important figure, if not the most important figure in professional wrestling in terms of what you saw on camera.
Yeah, so I think later on you'll see, if you ever search for Steroid Trial WWF, you'll see a little script, and it's got Terry Bollea's name on it, and it's got Linda Bollea's name on it, being the wife at the time of Hulk Hogan. And why is that important? Why is it suddenly important that it's Hulk Hogan? Maybe you can give some idea to everybody just how popular Hulk Hogan was in this era.
Yeah, and actually, you point to Terry Bollea, which is his real name, but I think initially, and we can, certainly people can check this out, I think even in the five names that were mentioned, they didn't even refer to him as Terry Bollea, so that this other name, just to kind of protect him. Now, I've never really got to the bottom of why the reasons given were, personal and private matter or something like that, but that's still a bit odd. But yeah, for it to be Hulk Hogan really would be something that would shock everyone, right? Because you are in this tabloid world where even if something is, half a truth or you don't have all the information, people are going to jump on this. Hulk Hogan had been professional wrestling sports entertainment since really 1984. Obviously, he was in Rocky 3, he was getting popular in the AW, but really it's the rock and wrestling angle from 1984 to the first WrestleMania 85. Hulk Hogan was the big superhero for people, especially for kids in the US, and then eventually all over the world, people like us in the UK, across all continents. Hulk Hogan was the flag bearer of the WWF, and he was the ultimate good guy. And he had this whole say your prayers, take your vitamins. He was the kind of embodiment of everything that is good and proper, not taking any shortcuts in life. And it was also, when this all started to happen, Wax, when the initial George Zahorian scandal came to light, and the media was starting to jump on this, and professional wrestlers were potentially mentioned. We've talked about this in our archives, and you can go and check it out when we talk about the 1991 period. But Hulk Hogan had appeared on the Arsenio Hall show. And the understanding from officials in WWF and indeed the wrestling media was that Hulk Hogan was going to appear on this show and say, yeah, in the past he used steroids, but it was allowed then, and it was something that he, did a little bit, but he doesn't do it anymore, or something to that effect. So essentially he would admit that he was a user, but, things had changed. But what Hulk Hogan did in that interview was he essentially denied ever using steroids. And that certainly threw the cat amongst the pigeons and would add to the headaches that, as the news was ramping up, his denial on what was a very popular show in the US then would really have big ramifications for the WWF.
Yeah, and he would have to clarify that it wasn't so much that he had never taken steroids. He had only taken them on 3 occasions, and they all related to injuries, and there were valid reasons for him having been prescribed.
Yeah, so it wasn't for in terms of performance enhancement, or indeed for just looking good.
Yeah,
he was doing
but very specifically,
purposes.
He does say, "I'm not a steroid abuser, and I do not use steroids." Then he clarifies he did use them 3 times. But I mean, anybody who has watched wrestling in the 80s, anybody who's seen Hulk Hogan in the flesh or on TV would clearly know that, he looks quite different to many of the talent on the WWF. He is absolutely jacked, especially I think late 80s. early 90s, he is looking prime Hulk Hogan. So for him to come out with that just flies in the face of what everybody is thinking at home, clearly.
Yeah, but he does talk about how much time he spends in the gym and working hard. I think the proof for the pudding was ultimately then going to be, if there is a drug policy or testing policy, would Hulk Hogan look the same as he did in that 1991 interview to say a year later, and then you could really tell if he would genuinely look like this or there'd be a difference in his appearance. And I think that's probably as the heat continued and the George Zahorian issue really became prime time, these types of considerations would be ringing through everyone's ears and mind.
Yeah, and this leads to a period of really bad press for the WWF and the wrestling industry in general, probably throughout 91 and 92. All the major networks were doing some sort of show on the WWF, use of steroids and other things. Pretty much all big commentators were talking about it in one way or another. It was in the papers. Hulk Hogan's name became really toxic.
Well, that's the thing. Just going back to what I was saying, you're going to take what's important. So Hulk Hogan is the flag bearer. So his name, it's going to be, this is the ultimate bad. And we know how the media works. And certainly, you're going to jump on the biggest star.
Yeah, and weirdly, he's not even on trial for anything. He's
exactly.
Neither is Vince, neither is WWF. All it is that their names are linked to having received steroids, but it's very quick how the downfall of somebody can come. And I would even argue it probably ruined his aspirations of a Hollywood career, because
I think his shitty choices of script probably ruined his aspirations.
I don't know. Mr. Nanny was amazing.
Well, I think this is all after, isn't it? Mr. Nanny, and he did try to do other things. Suburban Commando, I remember we've spoken about that in the archives, and I was really excited to see that. It could have, but I think in general, what you're probably alluding to is, we always talk about we became wrestling fans in 91, 92 was the peak of wrestling fandom for many in the UK. SummerSlam 1992, the huge crowd. But we were also talking about how at the same time in the US, crowds were dwindling, ratings were lower. We've just talked about, the Saturday night's main event, and we touched upon that in our last episode and how that was the lowest rated Saturday night's main event. So there was an impact, as you're saying, of all of this happening, it seems, on attendance, on TV ratings, because this wholesome form of entertainment with superheroes had basically received a bit of a black eye.
Yeah, and some of the accusers or testimony provided in the media by other wrestlers, for example, David Schultz, who's famous for that slap to that guy called Stossel. I can't remember his first name.
Yeah.
But if you've ever seen Dark Side of the Ring, you know exactly who I'm talking about. Hulk Hogan went to David Schultz and got injected several times, according to David Schultz, over 200 times. Billy Graham was another one who was seriously anti-steroids at this point. And his story is interesting as well, because he claims that he was hooked on steroids and prescription medicine, and that Vince knew all about it and was actively encouraging wrestlers to take steroids. It was
a very big allegation, and would be one of the things that people would jump on, right?
Yep. But that led Billy Graham to criticize Hulk Hogan a lot, especially over his whole message of, taking your vitamins and maybe you'll look like me, which I don't think he ever inferred. You take your vitamins and you look suddenly like I look. Yeah. That was just his saying. But people were very critical of that.
And this is very interesting, right? Because superstar Billy Graham was somebody who a number of wrestlers emulated. So Hulk Hogan emulated him. Jesse the Body Ventura, Scott Steiner later on. He was the original. If we're talking about this kind of jacked up, kind of California beach type of guy, that kind of character. It was really Billy Graham before any of these others, and the way he spoke, cut his promos. So all these guys were emulating him, and obviously Hulk Hogan became much bigger than superstar Billy Graham. So for him to come and criticize, and obviously, he's had his problems to this date with his steroid use. And as you say, in this period, he is really ripping into the WWF. And over the years, he has kind of fluctuated between being a supporter and really against the company. And as a side note, I heard recently he signed another contract with them. So probably a little bit more positive on them in the coming months.
Yeah, and he says all this back in the early 90s, despite himself admitting that he was an active user of steroids, and that he actually says he introduced Hulk Hogan to steroids. So obviously we realized that his view changed because of the issues that he had, and he thought at the time that he was being encouraged to carry on down that road. It wasn't probably until March '92, Dave Meltzer picks this up, that there was a steroid symposium that Vince organized, and he announced to the sort of media that they were starting their own steroid testing program.
Yep.
They had a wellness policy in place well before this, which covered, some recreational drug use and some other minor things. I think that was off the back of a famous story that involved Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Sheik.
Riding together.
Riding together, getting caught with a ton of cannabis. Cannabis.
I can assure everyone that Wax is actually absolutely fine today, and he's not on any cabanas. But
anyway, that was the story that sort of led them to a wellness policy. But it wasn't really until March '92 that steroid testing would start to come into play, and Vince really claiming to Meltzer himself that the testing showed the number of wrestlers using steroids had dropped from 50% to 15%, and the plan was to eventually get down to 0%. Obviously, within that group, there would still be people who were medically prescribed these pills and would still be able to use them. He even had an expert on one of these symposiums, and the expert said the tests were unbeatable, which Meltzer claimed that is complete nonsense, because there were people caught trying to falsify their urine tests and avoid what would be a 6-week ban. And actually, just to finish off, he mentions one wrestler specifically caught at this time and who would get a 6-week ban. That would end up being Sid Justice. And we talked about how that ended for him.
And I'm sure if Sid hears this, he might, exercise some justice on Dave Meltzer making these claims. To this day, Sid says that it wasn't the failed drug test, but it was his angle with the Ultimate Warrior. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is the interesting point, isn't it? We're actually seeing March of 1992. And this is where we keep talking about changes, and they're slowly, gradually going to come through this roster. Because you mentioned Hulk Hogan and the fact that Hulk Hogan looks so big and he is at the center point of this issue. It must have been highly stressful for him and Vince McMahon. But then we've talked about WrestleMania 8, where then before that, Hulk Hogan announces that he's going to retire, and he has that sit down with Vince McMahon. He has the match with Sid Justice in which the Ultimate Warrior turns, and that's it. We say goodbye to Hulk Hogan. So maybe we know it was a very smart move for him to kind of go away head off into the sunset and see what everything would be in a period of time. And at this point, as we said as kids, thought that's it, Hulk Hogan's retired, not knowing what was happening behind the scenes as 8 and 9-year-olds, but that was it. So Hulk Hogan has distanced himself away from the spotlight. I think we can now, everyone can agree that this was the reason behind that. There was no other reason. Yes, he had the Hollywood thing going on, but really it was the heat from this. Yeah. And then, let's look at some of the other names which naturally won't be there anymore. We look at the start of the year, and, we'll maybe do this when we do a Royal Rumble episode in some time, but the changes in the rosters. But let's look at some of the guys that are not going to be there anymore. By the time we hit October, November, we don't see guys like Hercules. We don't see the Warlord. We don't see the Barbarian. Hulk Hogan is taking some time off for other reasons. Legion of Doom are not there. But, these are people that are like those kind of big stereotypical wrestlers that are no longer going to be part of the roster. That's just an example of some of them. So, you were starting to see the effects of this perhaps on screen, and it become more and more visible as the year would progress.
It's something you said earlier about Hulk Hogan, whether he was using steroids is sort of the proof in the pudding. And if you looked at Hulk Hogan's appearance through 91, towards the end especially, and in the beginning of 92, you could really tell his body was not looking as prime as it was, a year before, 18 months before.
And absolutely, and we're jumping the gun a little bit here. We'll cover it when he returns in 1993. You can really see the difference. He's the trimmest you've ever seen him. So obviously, this had an impact on the visual presentation.
Yeah, and by August 92, even Meltzer is giving some praise to the WWF for cleaning up their house. He claims that genuinely there has been a fall in the number of people using steroids. There's still one guy who has a free pass at that point, and you talked a little bit about him as the Ultimate Warrior. and
Meltzer, and he's just got a bee in his bonnet about the Warrior, man.
He's claiming that Warrior failed several tests, but it's been covered up by Vince so far. We know that would change, and we'll talk a little bit more about Warrior in a future episode. But I mean, I think we could all say that most wrestlers that we watched growing up in the late 80s, early 90s used steroids pretty regularly at some point in their career. And even after that date, after steroid trials, they would still be prescribed steroid use. And wrestling was perhaps saved early 90s because it wasn't a mainstream sport. So there wasn't as much attention as there would have been if it was an NFL football team or a baseball team or whatever. Maybe that helped wrestling at the time by not being as mainstream.
Well, I don't know. I mean, yes or no, perhaps. I mean, they were at the forefront of this coverage. They were at popularity peak. I think they're probably, a target which a lot of people could jump on. And you're going to see some impact on the business. And up to this point where we are in October, November, you could probably say that was the case. But as we know, things are going to really snowball. And when Vince McMahon gets indicted in 1993, and there is going to be a trial against the WWF and him, then you know that actually, they're not going to get less of a deal. It's going to become really serious. But yeah, where we were at this point in time, it was probably, yes, as you say, if it was NFL or baseball or basketball, it would be an even bigger story. But even then, when you go back and check out some of these shows and things from 1992, the coverage was pretty intense.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I would like to point out, I mean, to this day, a lot of wrestlers, claim that the use of steroids is actually helps them in more than just enhancing their look. It is a health and safety feature almost, in that you're preparing your body to take all these bumps. I know Jim Ross is actually a big fan of saying, medically prescribed steroids are absolutely fine, and wrestlers should be able to get them because it helps them heal from injuries, helps them prevent injuries, helps them get their bodies ready. And I think there's some merit to that argument. It's more when they're abusing the system and, using extra doses or extra stuff. And maybe it wasn't even steroids that were the big issue. It was the prescription medicine that they obtained wrongfully when they didn't need it. And it's difficult to put together a case of, what caused all those untimely deaths that we're now so accustomed to over the last 20 years. Was it steroid use? Was it prescription medicine? Was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, isn't it? You go down that route because, people talk about roid rage. There are issues with this. I say prescription pills seem to be a big problem in professional wrestling. And this cocktail of these different things, and we've lost so many professional wrestlers at relatively young ages, and that's going to be a feature of these coming years, which is really sad. But it goes back to, I guess, the crux of the matter in this whole situation and eventual trial would be, was somebody making these wrestlers take these steroids to be successful, or was it a matter of choice? Was it an individual choice, or was it basically you have to do this or else? And that was really the crux of the whole thing, wasn't it? More than anything else. I mean, it was ultimately being, I guess, jumped on in different ways, and it was, covered by different reporters and commentators in different ways. But at the end of the day, it was really, do these wrestlers have to do this to keep a job, or is it a personal choice? And what is the level of education and knowledge here in terms of the law and what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do?
And what is your opinion, Fash? Were wrestlers made to feel like they needed steroids, or was it a personal choice that they took to
well, we're gonna cover this as it comes back to your I mean, what go with what the authorities say. I don't think you and I could really, as gung-ho as we can be and as opinionated as we can be, I don't think we can really make the call. But I mean, it seems the culture was to look good, and I think everyone has that choice. I mean, let's face it, Vince McMahon, the whole point of our recent episodes has been he makes that shift then. And, Bret Hart is your WWF champion. So there were still workers there in the company, a land of giants, which weren't, they're probably taking some of these enhancements. Of course they are, but not to the extreme level. And he's going to go towards the workers of Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, etc. And the NWA, WCW certainly had those type of workers. So I think it was, ultimately you would say, if I was making an assumption back then, it would be a choice. But then it's that whole situation, whether you feel you need to make that choice to be at a certain stage in your career, to be in a certain spot. So I think it's a debate which is quite deep, and certainly we couldn't resolve it in a minute or two.
Yeah, and we'll maybe save some of our further reflections for the full episode of the WWF up against the US government,
Yeah,
Vince
because like
McMahon
say, yeah,
specifically.
because as you say, right now it's all this stuff happening. Vince McMahon's implemented a policy. Wrestlers know that policy. We've seen, I say, certain people have left. Sid allegedly had failed that drug test. We didn't see him as the biggest heel in the company. He leaves post WrestleMania after some house shows. So, you're seeing the knock on effect. Hogan's gone. And we'll be mentioning two other major departures as well, which are linked to our previous episodes and what's going to happen at Survivor Series. So, there was a lot going on. But at this stage, as you say, it's very much WWF is mentioned, but they're not being put on trial. As we go into 1993, that's going to change. And then 1994 will be the big year of the trial. And at a point where people thought Vince McMahon would be charged and the WWF would be a very different place. So, yeah, there's so much to talk about this. Certainly, like I say, a lot of coverage in 1992, but the story would evolve as well. But you're going to see, well, we are seeing the impact of this as we talk through this year.
Okay, Fash, that's the end of our first part of our Scandals series. We'll move on to something bigger next episode. But there's a couple other things you wanted to mention and bring up to our fans.
Yeah, in terms of this two-part scandal special, as you say, we'll cover that. One clarification, Wax. So if people listen to our last show, and they would have picked this up, our loyal fan base, as we were talking about the Ultimate Maniacs, we were talking about the first match and only match at Saturday Night's Main Event. And then I mentioned that let's quickly talk about the other matches in the show. And then there's an abrupt cut and we just go to the end of the Maniacs. So the reason behind that, viewers and listeners, is that we did talk about the other matches on Saturday Night's Main Event. It was British Bulldog defending the Intercontinental title against Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart defending the WWF title for the first time on television against Papa Shango. But the show was running a bit long, and we thought, we'll cover those, and it's more appropriate to cover those two matches as part of our coming episodes. So aside from part two of the scandals piece that Wax is absolutely loving, he is our Dave Meltzer in this situation. We're also going to look at the two big firings which resulted as a result of the steroid situation. So we'd mentioned in our last show, Saturday Night's Main Event discussion, when we had that as part of the Ultimate Maniacs, that one of the Maniacs wouldn't make it to Survivor Series, and that Maniac sadly was the Ultimate Warrior. Similarly, another guy on that show wouldn't make it to Survivor Series either, and that's the British Bulldog. So we're going to talk about their essential leaving the WWF in coming episodes as well, and other debuts and departures will also be covered. So as we get to this Survivor Series show, Wax, there's so much going on and there's still lots to talk about. So I'm looking forward to covering these various topics in the coming shows.
Absolutely, Fash. Can't wait. Until then, this has been Wrestling with Memories.